by Vishanti.
Do we need to use this? Vishanti, do we need to use this mic?
Maybe, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, my name is Linda Chisholm. I'm chair of the PARI board. Before we begin, I would just like Vishanti Arumagam to quickly say a couple of words relating to housekeeping.
Hi, good morning. I just want to talk to you very quickly about accessing information about the 3 days. And we've set up an app that has the full program of the 3 days. It has a list of all the speakers. And I wanted to take you through a little bit of the functionality of that. And if you haven't already received a link to the app, there's a table set up outside and we can help you very quickly to get on it, get it on your phone so that you have access to the information all through the 3 days.
Sorry, can I have something to step back?
So, basically this is what the app looks like. The main tab here is the program, which you would just click on there, and it gives you a list of all the sessions that are happening through the days. And at the top here, you've got Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And the first thing
the guy who was standing here is when I do their health and safety briefing.
You're going to be attending, so that you have your own schedule and you can see what comes after what, because every day at every time slot there's parallel sessions, so there's always two things going on at the same time. So let's say we're all coming to the welcoming, we're going to go panel 1 and panel 4, for example, and then when you look at my schedule, it'll show you what you've chosen. Another thing that's quite nice about the app is you can go into a session, like this session, and you can then comment on what's happening in the session. And to do that, you go to this top right-hand corner, and there'll be a little icon there, like a share icon. Click on the share icon, say post to event feed, and you can say something about what's being presented, or you can just comment on what's happening in the session. And everybody who's on the app will be able to see which session you're commenting from and what you have to say, and they can reply to you if they want. So the rest of it is pretty intuitive. Just the other thing that I wanted to make you aware of is where you find papers and documents and abstracts. So if you go into a session, and you scroll right down to the bottom, there'll be a section that says documents, and if those speakers have agreed, then their documents and abstracts will be uploaded there. And it could be a presentation, it could be their full paper, it could be an abstract. Yeah, and another way to find that is to go to a speaker, and again, after their bio and information, you scroll down and you'll find the documents pertaining to that speaker. And if you don't want to read it on your phone, you can just email it to yourself and save it for later. And then just the last thing is that if you are logged into the app, you can go to your attendees and see who else is here. And if you want to connect to anyone else who's coming to the event, you can, sorry, I'm just using an example. And you'll see a little message icon there, and you can send that person a direct message if you like. And that's not public, nobody else will be able to see So that's all I really wanted to say. If you have any questions, we have a table outside, and we'll help you to get onto the app and answer any questions about that. And I hope you enjoy using it.
Isn't there someone from Health and Safety who's going to come and say something?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chef Doug Mongo. I'm the executive sous chef of this building. I just want to give you a quick overview of the health and safety precautions that we have here. So the first thing is, if you enter outside that door and go to the road, our evacuation zone is just outside the main gate. So if there's an emergency or a fire alarm or something that goes off, you'll hear it quite loudly. There'll be lights blinking. So just go outside the door, outside to the road, and outside the gate. If there's any medical issues, we have trained first aiders on premises. All our staff are trained like that. We've got first aid kits, and we will also contact emergency services if necessary. So please enjoy the conference, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my task here today is a reasonably simple one, and I'll keep it short as well. It is to welcome you most heartily to PARI's State Capture and its Aftermath conference. When I saw the hashtag State Capture After Capture, I thought perhaps this was a little premature, but I'm sure the conference itself will spend a lot of time unpacking and probing the meaning of whether we're in a state of after capture, and doing this from multiple perspectives. Our national context is one in which, despite a declared new dawn and despite determined efforts of new commissions of inquiry to confront accumulation via the state in the Zuma period, there are new revelations on a daily basis. In the city press, only the city press yesterday, there were stories of theft, not only of the bank, of provinces and parastatals, but also a key department in the state. It's an ongoing saga. It's not new, and it's something that needs continued investigation. It's a context that demands analysis, and it demands action. It demands historical and comparative analysis, and it demands insights from all disciplines, not only to look at the different dimensions of state capture, but also to consider the possibilities for moving forward and the implications of different possibilities. Now, PARI's excellent analytical and research track record has been characterized by, and it's also benefited from, bringing together researchers and policymakers, often to speak across very deep chasms of understanding and experience. But it's been an important initiative, and I'm very glad and happy to see that it's happening in this conference too. We will have people from government, we will have researchers from leading institutions, and especially also I want to welcome researchers from North America, from South America, from different parts of Africa, as well as from some of our leading research institutions here in South Africa. Thank you for coming, and welcome to all of you, also to this UJ campus on which I am incidentally based. That this conference has drawn so many of you from different parts of the world, as well as from South Africa, testifies to the urgency of the issues, to the need for a space to reflect, to learn from one another, and to consider alternatives. So moving forward, I just want to especially welcome and thank Judge Zach Yacoub, whom Mbongiseni Buthelezi will introduce, for agreeing to come and do the keynote at this conference. I also want to thank the donors for their confidence in the work of PARI, and especially Yellowwoods, OSF South Africa, RIGHT, the Millennium Trust, and the Social Justice Initiative. Thank you very much for funding this conference. Civil society partners are also contributing to the roundtables on the final day, and thank you to them too, and welcome as well. So to all of you, a hearty welcome. I hope you enjoy this conference, and I hope we will all learn in the course of it. But I would like to introduce you now to Mbongiseni Buthelezi, the new Executive Director of PARI. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, who many of you may know, joined PARI as a research manager in 2016. Before joining PARI, he held numerous research and teaching positions at the University of Cape Town, including senior researcher in the then Rural Women's Action Research Unit for the Center of Law and Society. He holds a PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University, and he writes on rural governance in South Africa, particularly the interface between traditional authorities, rural residents, and the state. Mbongiseni.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. In line with Vishanti's paperless revolution, I've tried to also follow suit and have no paper. So I'm going to try and read my notes off my laptop, and let's see if that works. Sanbonani, goeiemorgen. I won't do what we normally do in South Africa, which is greet people in all the 11 official languages. I'll just stop there. So, keynote speaker, former Justice of the Constitutional Court, Zak Yaqub, Chair of the PARI Board, Linda Chisholm, Mrs. Anu Yaqub, PARI Board members, funders, representatives of government institutions, representatives of foreign missions, panelists, and participants from far and wide, and members of the PARI team, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me start with a painful subject. The opening of this conference marks a bittersweet moment for many of us at PARI, and for me personally. Let me begin with the bitter. We have walked a long and at times arduous road to get to this conference. The founding director, now former director of PARI, Ivor Chipkin, led PARI's work that has resulted in this conference. He and I and other colleagues brainstormed the after capture program into being in the hallways of PARI. It should have been Ivor standing here in front of you at this moment. But today, he's not here to take part in this conference. I begin with this not to air PARI's laundry in public, but because we have received many questions in the lead up to this conference, with many people, some of whom are sitting in this room, wondering whether they should continue to associate themselves with PARI after the news of Ivor's resignation from the organization was published in a newspaper a month ago. I have decided to address the matter openly and upfront so that we can move past it and have what I trust will be a robust and fruitful conference over the next 3 days. Ivor Chipkin has indeed left PARI, the organization he founded in 2010, and which he built from scratch to what it is today. He resigned following an investigation into complaints related to abuse of power and sexual harassment leveled against him. From an organizational point of view, I think the point I want to make is I can safely say an independent process led by the Gender Equity Office at WITS was initiated to investigate and resolve the complaints. It was while the process was still ongoing and had not reached its conclusion that Ivor resigned. I want to assure all of you that PARI, with the close involvement of the board, is emerging into a new place. After a difficult and very painful past few months, we are growing from strength to strength as we undertake processes of healing and repair in the organization. Hence this conference. Let me come to the sweet part. The conference marks a sweet moment, also precisely because we have walked a long path to get through a rapidly changing political context to get here. We begin this conference at a very different time to the context in which it was first conceived. Many of the issues we're going to discuss in the next 3 days are now the subject of commissions such as the Zondo Commission, the Nugent Commission, and now the recently announced commission looking into the Public Investment Corporation. It's also been the subject of groveling apologies, such as we've seen from the Sunday Times, and counters to those apologies that we've seen recently from a former editor of the Sunday Times. Some other issues remain murky and puzzling, such as the role of state security, one of the subjects we're also going to discuss in this conference. We conceived the conference in the second half of 2017 as part of a broader after-capture program that has 4 legs to it. The first was a series of roundtables that we held at Wits University, where PARI is based. And it was to be followed by this conference, which is happening over the next 3 days, after which we're going to set up a set of technical commissions to draw up very detailed proposals for what sort of reforms we think need to happen in the state going forward in South Africa. And then that is going to be followed by the 4th leg, which will be engagements, particularly with political parties, going into the election next year, beginning this Wednesday with a televised debate among political parties about how to fix the state. The conference was conceived to be a follow-up to the release of the betrayal report, to the Gupta leaks, and to the campaigns by Save South Africa and the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation that had convened a conference on the 18th of July 2017. And I'm pleased to see that Nishan Bolton has just joined us. Welcome and thank you. Following years of abuse of power, frequent cabinet changes, and there had been 12 by the end of Zuma's tenure, the hollowing out of state institutions, including the South African Revenue Service, the Directorate of Priority Crime Investigations, the Hawks, and the National Prosecuting Authority, which were accompanied by steady denials and obfuscation of the rampant organized rent-seeking and corruption under the guise of radical economic transformation, the repurposing of the state at national level to serve a small elite became quite glaring by especially the end of 2016. This was especially so after the release of the Public Protector's report, State of Capture, on the 14th of October 2016. The report recommended, among other things, that the President of the Republic set up a commission of inquiry into state capture. This is the commission that is currently sitting not far from where we are, the Zondo Commission, as it is colloquially known, which was established in January 2016. One of the watershed events in this accelerating coming to light of the process of what has come to be known as state capture was the removal of Ntantanene as finance minister on the 9th of December 2015, I beg your pardon. His replacement, Pravin Gordhan, and Gordhan's deputy, Mcebisi Jonas, would also be shown the door in another cabinet reshuffle in March 2017. By this point, Jonas had publicly disclosed that he had been offered the position and 600 million rand to become finance minister, as had former African National Congress Member of Parliament, Feki Mentor, disclosed her allegation of being offered a ministerial position by one of the Gupta brothers. These disclosures precipitated close public scrutiny of the relationship between the Guptas, Zuma, and state institutions. The release of the Public Protector's report raised questions about what academics were doing to analyze and resist the phenomenon we are observing in the country. Mark Swilling from the University of Stellenbosch then convened what has come to be known as the State Capacity Research Project, which brought together researchers from the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at Stellenbosch, PARI, the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town, Wits University academics, including Lungile Mondi, and an academic from the University of Johannesburg, Mzogisi Qobo. The group released the Betrayal of the Promise report in May 2017 under tremendous fear from some of the people involved about personal safety, given the extent to which state security was being put to use to defend the power elite and to take on opponents as we are going to hear at this conference. The launch of the report the launch was on the 25th of May 2017. It was then followed 3 days later, on the 28th of May, by the beginning of the release of the so-called Gupta leaks. The emails supported the analysis of the betrayal report in many ways. The argument of the betrayal report, in brief, was that what we are seeing in South Africa was a shadow state that had emerged and had grafted itself onto the constitutional state. We were seeing the repurposing of state institutions to serve a small elite, and this project was being done under the guise of what was called radical economic transformation. We trace this to the rise of Jacob Zuma in the Polokwane conference of the ANC in 2008, arguing that the coalition, what has come to be known in South Africa as the coalition of the wounded, that had come together to propel Zuma to power, was a coalition of people that had some serious reservations, and correctly so, about the ways in which the South African economy had been transformed since the advent of democracy. Those reservations were that the way in which business had operated in South Africa was that there had been almost an investment strike by white business that had benefited tremendously from apartheid, and it had not invested in creating employment post-apartheid. The only people who had benefited were people, a small elite, which had political connections, that had been able to ride the coattails of white business. What the elite around Zuma was then arguing was that South Africa needed to create a new economy. And that new economy, it was looking to the procurement budgets of state-owned companies to drive the creation of this new economy. The language we were hearing from about 2011 from the Department of Trade and Industry was that this economy was going to be driven by creating 100 black industrialists. That project, in many ways, as many of us have argued, was a laudable project. But what happened very quickly was that that project then became hijacked by a small elite that had access to political power, and that project was then driven to the benefit of the small elite. It's a phenomenon, of course, that, as we know, is not new. That's why in the room we have colleagues from Argentina, from Kenya, from Angola, from Nigeria, in countries that are longer in the tooth than South Africa, and they have seen these things before, and we're hoping to learn from their experiences. There's much disagreement with this analysis of the betrayal of the promise report and the subsequent book that has emerged from it, titled Shadow State. There's been criticism that the report and the book are too focused on Zuma and the Gupta network, and they do not go further back enough into the roots of this capture that we saw in recent years. There's also been criticism that our analysis downplays corruption in choosing to foreground what we called a political project that was driving and being driven by Zuma at work in repurposing the state. This conference is an exciting opportunity then to take this conversation further. Even Zuma disagrees, of course, with our analysis. He said recently, there is no state capture in South Africa in a speech he gave in the Eastern Cape. He says the state is not captured. But we hope that we're going to use the next 3 days to do several things. Among them, we hope to deepen the analysis of what is state capture, going back to a conceptual discussion and a theoretical discussion of what are we talking about when we talk about state capture. Secondly, we hope to understand better how it has proceeded in South Africa as we have these conversations. Thirdly, we hope to put South Africa in conversation with other parts of the global South. As I've mentioned, there are colleagues from Argentina, from Brazil, and from other countries in Africa, including Nigeria, and Kenya, and Angola. And finally, we hope to then discuss how to move South Africa forward. That is, what reforms are needed to build strong and resilient state institutions and ethical leadership. Why should we remain vigilant in the age of Ramaphoria, and how do we do so? We deliberate on these matters at a time when the Zondo Commission is sitting. Hence, many a person we would have wanted to be in this conversation, has declined our invitation to be part of the conference. Nevertheless, we hope this conference will generate many new ideas as we learn from the experiences of countries like Nigeria, Brazil, Angola, and India, and others. We hope to come out of this conference provoked, energized, and emboldened to undertake the important work that needs to continue to be done to analyze and critique, but also to mobilize. I'm pleased to say that civil society groups convened by colleagues from Open Secrets who are in the room are making submissions to the Zondo Commission. My hope is that the conversations and the critiques that we undertake over the next 3 days will generate new thinking about things we need to do together as civil society and with committed civil servants in many parts of the state in the short and in the long term to rebuild a deeply damaged state for it to serve the needs of those that most need the state. And here we're talking about the jobless. We're talking about the people most in need of housing. We're talking about asylum seekers, the aged, and then the indigent. Once again, to reiterate what the chair of the board said, thank you for joining us at this momentous conference. We hope to continue the conversation well beyond this conference and deepen the learnings from the next 3 days over many years to come with our partners from around the country and from Latin America and other parts of Africa and from the United States. Let me then end by introducing very briefly our speaker, our esteemed speaker. Zak Yaqub is a retired justice of the Constitutional Court. He served on the Constitutional Court from 1998 to 2013, I beg your pardon. He hails from Durban and has had a very long and distinguished career, including representing and advising many people prosecuted for contravening security laws, emergency measures, and other oppressive legislation under apartheid. He was also involved in representing victims of unfair evictions and people who were required to pay unfair housing tariffs in Durban in particular. He was a member of the executive of the Natal Indian Congress from 1981 to 1991, in which capacity he organized and took part in many protests, produced and distributed publicity material, and organized and addressed many anti-apartheid mass meetings. He was a member of the executive of the Durban Housing Action Committee from 82 to 85 and was involved in action aimed at ensuring that the Durban City Council managed its housing schemes fairly. He has since then also advised many local government bodies, the National Land Committee, and the Department of Finance. And generally, since his retirement from the Constitutional Court, he's been, I think for many of us, a voice of reason, a sage voice that has said many things that many people were unable to say. And so with that, may I invite Zak Yaqub to address us. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's right. There's a microphone.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very, very much for having me open this very, very important conference, not only for the future of South Africa, but I would say that for the future of working democracies in various regions and even regions throughout the world. It's a very important initiative which we must take extremely seriously. We need to discuss matters openly and appropriately and make sure that the recommendations that come out of the conference are practical in nature and take things forward. I'm going to address a number of issues in the hope that those issues will help us look at the nature of the problem. Broadly, what we have to do in the next few days is to deepen our understanding of exactly why state capture happened. What were the circumstances that gave rise to it? What were its consequences? and the steps that we need to take to reform the state. For unless we are honest about the full causes of state capture, unless we face state capture in its absolute entirety, even if we hide one small element away and refuse to face it and refuse to bring it into the overall analysis, our solutions would be wrong. So let us be completely frank with each other, and let us look at each of these things as they occurred. Let us then start with, and one of the problems is that state capture is associated with Zuma. People tend to think that Jacob Zuma was the cause of the problem. People tend to think that somehow, miraculously, now that Jacob Zuma is gone, everything is going to come right virtually automatically. My thesis is that while Zuma behaved miserably badly, he is not the only cause of the problem. That the causes go far back, that the causes go as far back as the supply of arms to South Africa during anti-apartheid, during apartheid times, in breach of international sanctions, that the problems go far back to the arms deal, the problems more recently in relation to state capture, the problems concern the way in which the state conducted its activities. It concerns the whole of the cabinet as it operated in our country, not only before 1994, but from 1994 to now. And that you will find that there are very, very few people in power who will be able to say that they had nothing or very little to do with it. In a sense, I hope I will show that the extent of the problem is huge, that the solution is going to be a very difficult one, and there are some prerequisites which we will have to enter into. First, of course, to go to the causes in the past. Many of you, I think, were present at about a month ago when we delivered a report of the Economic Crimes Tribunal, which came to a number of very important and useful conclusions. And I would commend that report to all of you to read quite carefully as the backdrop of the discussions that we are going to have here. Basically, there were a number of findings made by the International Economic Crimes Tribunal. The first is that there was a breach of international law. There was the commission of much crime. There was a system of money transfers which was set up by a whole range of commercial institutions. There was collaboration by a whole range of other governments to break the arms sanction and to make sure that South Africa managed to procure arms through all sorts of unlawful, improper means. And the difficulty is that once you get into this impropriety, and if you do not sort it out, you have a huge problem. So I want to say to you that the problems of state capture actually go right back to that point in time when there were sanctions busting by the evil apartheid regime. But the problems go worse than that, because somehow our governments ended up being complicit, even the democratic government. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't look at these areas very carefully. One would have expected that punishment of all these people for the commission of these international crimes would have been absolutely essential to the reconstruction of our society. And it is the report of the tribunal, and it is something I agree with completely, that one of the things we need to do is to come to terms with this, to make sure that appropriate steps are taken by the government and everybody else to resolve these problems, and to make sure that everybody involved there is properly prosecuted as soon as is possible, even though much time has elapsed. And there's a problem, because if you don't prosecute these crimes, then the dirty, unfinished history remains. And for some reason, once you allow huge criminals of this kind to go free, you start on a different moral compass. You start by beginning to think that crime doesn't always have to be punished, that there are circumstances in which crime can be swept under the carpet. And once a democracy starts on that basis, we've got very, very serious problems, because pushing crimes under the carpet becomes, shall we say, a kind of habit. Then the next thing that happened, of course, and all of you are aware of that, is the arms deal in our country. Again, nobody has properly been prosecuted. There has not been proper investigation. It is quite clear that crime was committed. It is quite clear, too, that the arms deal was actually a continuation of what happened during apartheid. Had it not been for the sanctions-busting operations, the arms deal could not have taken place as easily. Had those people been prosecuted then, the arms deal could not have taken place that easily. So the arms deal, in an odd way, was a continuation of sanctions busting, except that now people involved in our democratic government were making the money and doing things wrongly. It wasn't the white apartheid people who were doing these things. And finally, as a result of the arms deal, came state capture of the kind that we know it. And again, there is a continuity. If you understand the facts carefully, the sanctions busting leads to arms deal leads to state capture, and therefore there's a great deal of unwinding to be done before we work out the direction in which we're going to go and what we're going to do. So let us not blame Zuma only. Let us have an interesting understanding of where we are going and understand this at its roots. So I want to say firstly that in order to get the society right, it is absolutely urgent for all international sanctions-busting crimes to be prosecuted either in South Africa or in international crimes tribunals, so that we begin to make a clean start. Because you can't clean things at the top alone. You've got to clean things right from where things started. So a prerequisite would be the prosecution of these people. A prerequisite, secondly, is to go into the arms deal carefully, see what crimes were committed, and ensure that these crimes are appropriately prosecuted. And then, of course, state capture too, one needs to go into it very, very carefully and make sure that prosecutions happen. Because unless prosecutions happen, unless people are punished for what they've done, our society this is not the kind of crime where any kind of truth and reconciliation can work. And then I must say a word about commissions and warn that commissions can be quite satisfying. Commissions, if enough of them are appointed, can blunt the edge. And very, very often, and I'm not saying that it is the case with the commissions that we have now, I'm just warning that very often that happens with the Arms Deal Commission. What happens is that commissions take a long time, they make recommendations, and as evidence is revealed before the commission, people begin to feel satisfied that things are being done. It is a false sense of satisfaction to think that once there are commissioned recommendations and commission findings placing blame where that blame belongs, the problem is actually over. In my view, it is absolutely dangerous to have a situation in which you stop at commissions and leave it right there. Because then the commissions become a way in which you ultimately don't prosecute people. So what I must say very, very strongly is that if all these commissions are not followed by criminal prosecution for the crime that people did, then I'm afraid we're not going to get anywhere. So we need to ensure a good policing system. We need to ensure a good prosecution system. We need to get international help if possible. But we need to help our government along to get this right. If we don't reform the police system, don't reform the prosecution system, we're not going to get very, very far. As I understand it, there's a consultation process now for the appointment of the National Prosecuting Authority person. But you see, there are other more difficult problems. And I want to address the argument that Zuma was the only one at fault. The thinking is that Zuma appointed the National Director of Public Prosecutions badly. The thinking is that Zuma appointed the police bosses at various levels. The thinking is that because Zuma made all these appointments, and somebody has said that the president is being given too much power, and that is why these things happen. But what we need to realize is that Zuma, in terms of the Constitution, the president of the country has no power to make these appointments on his own. The National Director of Public Prosecutions, judges in our country, the appointments of commissions as well, they are all functions in terms of Section 85 of the Constitution. And all these functions are performed by the President in consultation with the Cabinet. So it is the President, the Deputy President, and each and every member of the Cabinet which is responsible for each of these decisions, and they must actually take responsibility. There are one of two things. Either members of Cabinet and the Deputy Presidents at the different times did not read the Constitution at all and didn't understand what their responsibilities were, in which case they are criminally responsible. Alternatively, and this might, I don't know which is worse, alternatively, they knew what their responsibilities were. These decisions were all taken at Cabinet meetings where each and every minister would be responsible. But now it is convenient to put the blame on somebody else. So when you talk about the appointment of police seats, when you talk about the appointment of the National, the Prosecuting Authority, when you talk about any disciplinary proceedings, all these matters that in relation with, to which decisions have been taken, Cabinet takes the decision. So I think it is very important for the future for ministers to understand their responsibilities in accordance with the Constitution. They must understand their responsibilities sufficiently and take collective responsibility for what happens. Part of the problem is, maybe that our ministers need to be educated on what their constitutional responsibilities are. I just wonder how many cabinet ministers have studied sections 84 and 85 of the Constitution. How many people realize that the whole of the cabinet is responsible? Now I think that that is one thing that people must begin to understand very, very clearly. Otherwise, we are not going to get anywhere at all. Having said that, we need to ensure the appointment of proper public prosecutors, proper policemen, all must be done through a proper process. And I think what has been started now a consultation process for the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions might be a very good thing. But it may also be a very good idea, because part of the problem is that in our system of government, the separation of powers between the executive on the one hand and the legislature on the other hand is not worth really much. It's not worth much because of the party system, because of the absence of constituency representation, and because, let's say, the ANC has 62% of the vote in the country. They appoint the cabinet, which comes from the ANC. The ANC determines policy. The ANC is in complete control. And the idea, ordinarily, that members of the African National Congress, who are members of parliament, are going to bring their own leaders, the senior members of their own political parties who are cabinet ministers, or the boss of the political party who is the president of the country, if they are going to, the notion that the members of the ANC are going to call their own people very seriously to account is a very, very difficult notion indeed. And we understand what happened in Nkandla. It was quite obvious that those things, the upgrading work done there had nothing to do with security. And yet, in my view, people just lied to protect each other. Every member of the cabinet during Nkandla time would have known, or ought to have known, that these security upgrades are not good. They are not acceptable under any circumstances. And yet, nobody, but nobody from the ruling political party, not a single cabinet minister, ever said a single thing. So again, cabinet must learn to take its full responsibilities. We must learn to understand our constitution and work that through quite carefully. Then there's another problem. The other problem is about the duties of members of parliament. We all know that members of parliament get sworn in and they undertake to uphold the constitution and the law, to protect it and to uphold it. The president does, each cabinet member does, each member of parliament does. And the interesting question which we've got to work out is, what do members of parliament do if what they are asked to do by the African National Congress as Congress members, and that applies to each and every political party, do they vote in accordance with their own consciences in terms of the Constitution, in terms of their duty to uphold the Constitution, in terms of the duty to be responsive and accountable, in terms of their duty to be honest and open? Or does taking the oath in Parliament, which says, I will uphold the Constitution, have the words, I will uphold the Constitution, been substituted somehow in the minds of so many people as if the oath in Parliament says, I shall follow the African National Congress? And the oath in Parliament does not say that. So we've now got to understand what the oath in Parliament means. All political parties need to understand the Constitution, need to know their Constitution, and understand that their duty, and this does not apply only to the African National Congress, this applies to every political party in power. There must be a very clear understanding that the duty of members of Parliament is to uphold the Constitution. I think we may need to start thinking about some other ways, unless we get it right, we may have to think about some other ways of ensuring an appropriate separation of powers between the executive and others. Then there is a difficult problem of people wanting to make money easily. And that history has a very interesting root. That history has a root in apartheid. That history has a root which shows us that most of the members of parliament who got into a new parliament in 1994 were actually very, very poor people. They had absolutely nothing, which is not the case in many other countries where parliamentarians normally have a house or something of that sort. So they were very poor, and capital moved into the bargain quite quickly. Capital was very quick in beginning to understand that there is a weakness here. So we all know that this kind of corruption that we are talking about do not represent the actions of government alone. They represent the conduct of capital and the government. Civil society on the one hand and government on the other. You must have two parties to a corrupt deal, not only one. And therefore the private sector cannot disclaim responsibility. In most of these cases, the private sector is as responsible as the public sector. And therefore the work that is necessary is not aimed at reforming the private sector, the public sector alone. I think that the private sector must take full responsibility. It is the duty of organizations of this kind to make sure that the private sector takes full responsibility. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere with that either. At the moment, the private sector, particularly capital in this country and business in this country, take the view that what they have done is all absolutely and utterly correct, and that the fault lines are only in government. The trouble is that there are fault lines in civil society, there are fault lines in political parties, of course, there are fault lines within capital, there are fault lines where there is greed in capital and greed in government. And somehow we have to ensure that we have a program where people understand that capital too is a serious guilty party in all of this, and that if we think that problem can be solved by simply reforming government, it is not going to work at all. There must be a new way in which we in the private sector begin to look at the way in which we conduct our lives, because there is an interaction between the way in which the private sector conduct their lives on the one hand and what happens in the public sector. Corruption can only happen if two people clap hands. And therefore, the change that we need to bring about is not limited to the public sector alone. It is also limited it also embraces the private sector. And then, of course, in the public and private sector, there is the need for constitutional education. You would have noticed that while there was a lot of talk about the Constitution and ensuring that the constitutional injunctions be fulfilled, when we started our government, our democracy in 1994, as time has gone on, the reference to the Constitution has become less and less and less. And I wonder, how many parliamentarians understand our Bill of Rights? How many parliamentarians understand precisely what their duties are in terms of the Constitution? How many parliamentarians understand their responsibilities of accountability and openness? By the way, when I retired as a judge, I made an offer to Parliament that I'm quite happy to conduct classes on their understanding of the Constitution free of charge. My letter did not even receive an answer, despite the fact that it was followed up by a few more letters later. So again, parliamentarians, the Constitution has got to come to the forefront. The values of our Constitution of dignity, human dignity, equality, and freedom, the improvement of the quality of lives of all our people. So there must be an understanding of these constitutional obligations amongst all political parties and upon everyone who governs us at every level. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. And part of this also is that hopefully we'll get to the situation where our children will start learning about our constitutional values, that we will have introduced in schools our constitutional obligations, that when they grow up and they get into business, whether they get into business or whether they get into government, they are infused with the values of our Constitution. The problem is that at every level, our Constitution and its values of openness and democracy and so on have taken a backseat. Its values in relation to caring for vulnerable people is not there. And therefore there's a great deal of work to be done to ensure that the values of our Constitution are understood by more and more people, that they are embraced by more and more people. And as more and more people in our country begin to live the values of our Constitution, in the long term, that is the only route to go. If the people in our country, more and more of them, began to live the values of our Constitution, the chances of government malpractice are likely to go down considerably, because hopefully the politician who will come into power, who goes to school today and learns about the Constitution and begins to live its values when the kid's 5 or 6 years old, when that person gets into power, even as a president or whatever, when they are 50 or 60, obviously the values of the Constitution have been so well imbibed that it is extremely unlikely that anything else will happen. And then, of course, there is the electoral system. The problem is very, very deep, because we have many, many poor people in our country. The fact that there are poor people in our country means that poor people become manipulable. And poor people become manipulable by, not by any sophisticated way. When people are poor, when people are starving, when people are absolutely miserable, you've got to face the fact that a piece of Kentucky chicken with a beer or a bottle of Coke buys the vote. So, if our political parties get to buying votes, get to getting votes by misrepresenting things and talking lies, which many of them do, that is not the basis of a strong democracy. So somehow there must develop a new ethic within political parties in terms of which people are not forced or tempted to vote in particular directions. Our voter education programs have really got to increase to make sure that more and more of our voters know what they are doing and are able to make informed choices at the time when they take the vote. And our society should have developed to the situation where the whole of society ought to have cried out against the notion that a man who has had sexual intercourse with a young friend's daughter of his thought that he could have a shower to ensure that he didn't get HIV from her. A man who has had corruption charges withdrawn against him under very, very difficult circumstances. There is a serious problem in the nature of our society if a person of that sort is enamored, valued, and actually made the president of the country. So somehow we have got to have a public education campaign which makes us all automatically say, no, this person with these values and this approach to life is not good for us. And again, it's the manipulation of poor people, it's the manipulation of people who have less knowledge that gives rise to this kind of problem. So friends, the job is a very difficult one. It starts with the prosecution of those people who have been guilty of offenses in the past. It starts with the prosecution of people who did things now. It is about ensuring collective responsibility for what people do. It is about ensuring a societal education in relation to the development of constitutional values. And while we may take a few of these steps, my own view is that this is a huge project. It doesn't get solved in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. We've got to tackle it carefully, slowly, deliberately, one bit at a time. And if we can say in 5 years that the value of our society is 5% better than it was 5 years ago, I think we would have made a wonderful move forward. So let us not think that there are quick fixes. Let us not think that suddenly when we have one person out of the way, things will change. Let us not think that the government is going to become open and responsive immediately. And then, of course, there are interesting things about an understanding by public members of the public administration and political office bearers about their role in society, their governance role. Ultimately, and you heard this, the Minister of Police said that he didn't do anything at all to push the prosecution of Boyson. All the minister did was wanted the police to account to him in relation to that case. Now I ask you, surely a Minister of Police is involved in setting up police structures, appointing people, determining policy, ensuring appropriate training, ensuring that proper systems are set up, and so on and so on. Since when does the Minister of Police want to have reported to him about a particular case? That's interfering at the micro level with the work which be done not by politicians, but by professional police people. So I end here, and I hope that we'll have some discussion and that we begin to understand the enormity of the task that we have in ensuring that our society is a truly democratic one, based on openness, responsiveness, and accountability, and based on human dignity, equality, and freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zach.
Right.
This one?
Okay. Questions?
It's all right. There we go. Please join me in thanking Zach Yacoub for that wide-ranging and stimulating. We find ourselves in a situation where we've been very generous to ourselves with time. We had not intended to open up for discussion at this point, but Zach would like to invite conversation if anybody has any questions. And then we will, I think, move our tea break earlier so that we can start the next session slightly earlier than initially planned. Any initial comments, questions to just get our thinking going? I mean, on the on the question of democracy, on the question of holding people to account for crimes committed during the apartheid era, on questions around commissions that Zach has been so provocative about, and the ways in which commissions can demobilize us. Any thoughts? Here's firsthand. Please.
Morning, my name is Joan Stott. I'm the policy manager at South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And I just wanted to ask the speaker, you know, what his thoughts are on why we kind of shy away from prosecuting to the extent that he says we should. Is it, you know, a fear of what we might find? Is it a fear of our inability to overcome those problems? Your thoughts would be welcome, thanks.
Thank you. I'll take a second hand on that side of the room. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Nondando Kablana is my name. I'm with Ephesus Copland, an NGO based in East London. Just to end with some thoughts on the electoral process. And rightly so, I mean, it has been said that a number of the problems that we are finding ourselves grappling with have a lot to do with the electoral system that we have. And the mere fact that we get members of parliament or members of legislatures who were elected through this system in which very few people participated, would then find or believe that they cannot account to the broader electorate because they were not elected by it anyway. There's a number of challenges with the current electoral system. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what possible reforms could be in place. I mean, you make a note about President Zuma and the caliber of the person that he was at the time, and the mere fact that society allowed him to take over as president. And the argument behind that is that society didn't vote him into power, the ANC did. And so, I mean, I'm just interested in your thoughts around reforms for the electoral process.
I'll ask Zach to respond to those two, and I'll take another round. There's two other hands at least. Here you go. You can just stay there, Zach, if you want to. Okay. Yeah, there's the microphone.
Okay, thanks very much. As far as the first question is concerned, there are a number of problems. The first is that prosecutors are not properly trained. The second is that we have politicized the whole process. So that if you, for example, have a junior prosecutor earning 500,000 rand a year, and you as the president promote him to become the prosecutor's boss in this country, earning 3.5 billion a year, do you think the president needs to ask him to favor him? He's already so, how many of you have ever had a job where from one job to the next your salary has gone up fivefold? So once you make those sorts of appointments, it becomes a problem. So I think appointments is one thing. The training of prosecutors is another thing. The understanding by prosecutors and the whole prosecuting authority that their job is to create a constitutionally acceptable society. Prosecutors don't understand their role. They just go about on a day-to-day basis doing their work. And I have found in my own experience that the apartheid prosecutors were really, really doing their job absolutely thoroughly to the extent of being malicious with all of us in those days. Now, that prosecutorial fervor has somehow gone. And I think that there are divisions within the prosecuting authority, so the revival of the prosecution authority is one very important thing, and it doesn't rest on simply appointing a person as the boss of prosecutors. That person who is the boss of prosecutors has to have a vision of how the prosecution system is to be reformed, what sort of training you give to prosecutors, how you ensure that prosecutors do their work with a sense of purpose and understand the importance of their work and how good it is, and how you develop a system of ethics and credibility and force within the prosecuting authority. It's a long job. It is a difficult job, which we have to do. There has to be training, training, training. Otherwise, our prosecutions are never, never, ever going to come right. And we've got to stop this thing about having different strands in the prosecution service. We've got to have somebody who has a vision to unite people as best as they possibly can. As far as the electoral system is concerned, we can talk about the electoral system, but I have to say that for so long as most of our voters are very poor, and for so long as the level of their education does not render them vulnerable to the extent where they can be manipulated to do whatever you want them to do because of poverty and the absence of education, no magical electoral system is going to fix it. Having said that, we have a proportional system, and at the time in 1995, 1996, when we were negotiating these things, and I was part of that negotiating process, the ANC had actually undertaken that they would, that this total proportional representation at national and provincial level is going to be a temporary thing, and that very soon a measure of constituency basis will be put into the scheme of things. And the constituency basis would mean that a person gets elected by a particular constituency, by a particular area, and then is responsible to that area. So I think that the building in of some kind of constituency basis in our electoral system will help. But I must stress that it is not a question of electoral systems. It is more a question of the education of people, the strengthening of our people, reaching a situation where we will make really careful, informed choices. And quite apart from that, there are people today even who say the ANC is very bad, it's corrupt and so on and so on. But it's difficult to think of anybody who is different from the ANC. So there are many, many so-called sophisticated people who understand these things who would still say, we are forced to vote for the ANC in 2 years' time. Now, I don't know. I don't know why people don't form a new political party. So what happens is that the rhythm and the vigor has gone out of our politics. We have begun to take things lying down. We've begun to take the path of least retreat, and I think those are where the problems really, really lie. So I must emphasize that it's not the electoral system. You can bring in a constituency-based thing and so on. It won't work too much. Another thing is that political parties are constitutional instruments, and therefore all political parties need to commit themselves to the Constitution. And there's a problem. There's a problem about that with all political parties. The ANC will not commit itself to the honesty required by the Constitution at all. The DA will not commit itself to the affirmative action part of our Constitution. They'll find it very, very difficult to work its way through. But I think that the commitment of political parties to our value systems and our constitutional value systems is a very important part of electoral reform, actually, because it is the political parties which conduct the elections, it is the political parties which fight the elections, and if they do so from the perspective, from a constitutionally informed perspective, they are likely to do things a little bit better.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, what you mean? People? No, but the public voted the political party in when they knew that Zuma was going to be the president of this country. So in 2009, when the people voted the African National Congress into power, they knew that Jacob Zuma was going to be the president of this country. They knew about his sexual prowess. They knew about the fact that corruption charges had been withdrawn against him under very difficult circumstances. In other words, they knew he was an out-and-out rogue. Nevertheless, they vote for that organization that has an out-and-out immoral rogue as its president. So if you vote for a party whose president is an out-and-out known rogue, immoral to the core, what do you expect from the rest of the political party? So, I mean, this business of the people didn't vote for him does not cut ice, because when they went to vote, they knew that he was going to be their president. And many, many of them knew that he was a rogue. And again, after Nkandla, in 2014, people vote for the ANC again when they try to sidetrack things. So again, we have got to make sure that our people are stronger when it comes to voting, and that we are able to understand what we're doing properly.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last round. I've got a hand here, a hand there, and one last hand over there. Please, will you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thank you. Erin McCandless from Wits University School of Governance. Thanks for the superb presentation. My question is, what specific government commissions or mechanisms do you think could have best addressed structural crimes of apartheid, both in the public and private sector?
I don't understand that.
And given that it didn't take place, what do you think are the best ways now? And are there any precedents in other countries that actually did this well? Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Peter Nzizwa. I'm from UCT. I just want to make a quick follow-up on the issue around the electoral system. You mentioned the fact that political parties are constitutional instruments. I agree, because the Constitution says we have a party list proportional representation system, which in a sense put political parties in the mix, and as you call it, they are political instruments. I mean, they are constitutional instruments. The same Constitution says that these very people who are elected through this party system must take oath of office in terms of the Constitution. Now, in my sense, there is a balance that needs to be struck here. Firstly, the fact that these people are elected through the party system, they got into parliament through, the party, through the party. Now, their allegiance naturally will be to the party. Now, there is an oath of office in parliament. How do you balance these two? The fact that they need to pay allegiance to the party and the constitution at the same time. The second point it relates to the system at local level, which is the mixed system. The PR, and then there's a constituency-based system. And you do mention in your response to the first set of questions that we need to kind of use, or maybe you say the initial idea was that we will change to go towards the constituency-based system. We have a system that is working at local level. It is not working as we would like. Do you think that is a system that we need to replicate elsewhere, say at the national and provincial level, given the fact that, in my sense, it is captured by these constitutional instruments, the political parties, even the one or constituency-based councillors at that level, now have to report to the party. They are financed by the party, so they pay allegiance to the party. So would you think we need to replicate that, even though we see that it is not working as well? Thank you.
Thank you. As I go across the room, I also just want to say I'm heartened by the fact that when it comes to the transparency of political parties and their funding, we now have a bill before the president the political party funding bill through the work of many civil society organizations in this room, led by My Vote Counts, which has pushed to the point where there is now a bill where political parties need to disclose their funding. It's sitting on the president's desk, and we need to put pressure on the president to sign this bill into law.
Hi,
We'll introduce.
I find the conversation on the electoral system interesting, but I think that considering what is happening globally and how compromised people are occupying the political moment, it's important. I think it's important for us to reflect on why Zuma rose in the first place, especially given the fact that why Zuma rose in the first place, especially given the fact that now a lot of people who did support him then are actually saying that they did know his history before. So I think even before we talk about who the voters vote for, who has been put forward by political parties, we also need to interrogate why it is, how is it rather, that certain individuals capture imagination, and how is it that the same, if I can use that, amongst us actually tend to support these people. Zach, you do say that his sexual prowess, which I wouldn't call it that, but I get what you're saying. But I mean, the thing is, everything that Zuma has come and shown actually proves the fact that he should never have been an MEC of finance, he should never have been a deputy president, and most importantly, he should never have been a president or ever been allowed to be a president. So I think unless we reflect on particular positions that we ourselves had taken and went along with that, we're going to get another individual who's again going to capture the political. But we see this is happening all over the world. You see over Donald Trump, you see a whole range of, you see this, and there's a particular moment why individuals that are morally compromised, that are known to be greedy in terms of money and so on, why they rise as part of a wider conversation on state capture. So I think it becomes important that the particular kind of individual that we support or who appeals to us at a particular moment must in fact be interrogated, and I think they're very hard questions that we need to ask of ourselves.
Thank you. Zach, can I ask for your final comments, please?
Okay. Firstly, you're right that it is the political that needs to be interrogated, and we all know what happened there. And the political manipulation of our society is really quite bad, and we had gotten into believing that the means justify the end. So the opportunists, and there are many political opportunists at this point in time, who want a particular kind of society, they get promised it by the president himself, and therefore then it doesn't matter whether he's dishonest or not, and so on and so on. We understand that the means we use are not so good, but it justifies the end, because the end is what he is promising. He is promising a people's society at one level or another. So I think there is an approach on our side which quite often says that the means justifies the end. We learned some of that thinking during apartheid too, I think. And I think that that approach was adopted during the struggle against apartheid, even by people like us. And it's very difficult after that to say that approach of means justifying the end and so on may have been justified, and it's a big may, during the times of apartheid when we were fighting in the struggle for justice. But that approach can never be justified in an open and democratic society. And my view is that that really is the problem. And of course I'm speculating here a little bit because, as far as local government is concerned, The difficulty is that, again, we have not put in place mechanisms to facilitate and capacitate local government. And when we drafted the Constitution, we were very aware of that, and therefore national and provincial government have the duty in the Constitution to facilitate and capacitate local government and provide training and so on, which we don't do. So that is part of the problem as far as local government is concerned. I think that the funding, the political parties question is actually going to work to a degree, and it will be a very good way forward. And finally, the crimes against apartheid. I think that there were just deals done at the time. There may have been deals done behind the scenes in 1994. Nobody has yet come out with them. The only explanation which I can think of is there was some kind of international negotiation in which, quite wrongly, the powers that be here might have, by implication or explicitly, agreed that we will leave these governments and these large institutions and these international crimes alone on the basis of some understanding that these big, huge international companies and foreign governments and so on will help us in reconstructing our country. There may have been some kind of deal, with every party being quite honest about it at the time, but we didn't understand that it is not a good idea to believe governments who have known to have been corrupt and miserable in the past in relation to apartheid, when they say, forgive us our actions now, we will help you in the future. I think that the temptation to believe some of these things is great, but again, if one were to go back, to believe that people who supported apartheid before are suddenly going to support the development of a free and equal society in this country, if their letter of prosecution is, I think, a difficult thing. So my speculation is that that is what actually happened. And that is what continues to happen, and these kinds of deals will continue to be made. So we have to be very careful about how we structure what we do. So thank you very much. I think we'll end here. Well, no, that question I thought I dealt with, which is that we've got to educate them. We've got to start this whole process of educating political parties and starting to raise this debate. Are you upholding the Constitution, or are you upholding your political party? We've got to start that debate. It is a very, very important debate to be had.
Once again, thank you, Zach, for your comments and for your very provocative remarks. I think it's got our thinking going. Yeah. Just one thing before I make some housekeeping announcements. Nomboniso's statement about the political moment being occupied by people who are compromised makes me wonder whether there are any glimmers of hope. And I think of the Angolan case, which we're going to hear about in the first session tomorrow morning. Whether what is happening in Angola now, what we are seeing with the change in political leadership and the actions of the new political leaders offers us, it begins to offer us some glimmer of hope, some view of what might be possible. And so I look forward to that session very much. At the same time, of course, we have the case of Brazil, where things might go very badly in the next election. And what does that mean, in fact, for this global conversation that we're beginning to have? With that, let me just make some housekeeping announcements. Toilets, if you go out the door to your right, you'll see the signs there to your right down that way. The second thing is, please, there's a note up there, please join us this evening after the end of this session, which ends at 7:30. We're going to have a cocktail session at 8 o'clock, I mean, sorry, 1800 hours, 6 o'clock, with the well-known comedian Conrad Koch and his puppet, Chester Missing. So we're going to hear the lighter side of state capture this evening. Please join us for that. And then finally, we're going to now divide this room into two, and the two parallel sessions are going to happen on either side of this wall. Just to remind everybody, and to make sure that you are comfortable with it, we are live streaming this conference, and that's why you see cameras at the back. But we also have two colleagues from Ngomso taking notes. They're going to compile a report of this conference, which we're then going to use for the next steps in the process. So please, if just make sure that you are please comfortable with being live streamed, and if you're not, please let us know. Thank you very much. Let's take a break and let's return in 20 minutes at 11 o'clock to two separate rooms. On either side, yeah, this is gonna be closed off now.
Very well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good, my darling.
Love to see you. I'm very well. I'm fine. How are you? Okay. Okay.
Commissioner, how are you, sir?
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
I went to the wrong class.
Oh, no.
I hope it was worth your while. Thanks very much. Thanks. Okay. Well, thank God we had that economic crimes tribunal last month.
Yes, no, well, I'm quite inspired to go and read it.
Mm.
So you've got something to So are you staying for the rest of the...
I'm staying for the rest of today. I don't like to do it.
I was into the DG, I missed the stop.
I